Hey everyone, Chelsea here from Sew Simple Home. We are going to sew pajama pants today. So this is the kids pajama pant that's in the Sewing Basics for Beginners course. But this method of sewing pajama pants is pretty common across the board. There are different methods to sew pajama pants, but this method is by far the easiest in my opinion. And pretty much the most foolproof. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in and we're going to get sewing. So you'll need your pajama pant pattern, whichever it is, whether you have the kids pajama pant pattern, whether you have the happy holiday pajamas, the Jean and Jamie pajamas. A lot of them are very similar, or another pattern that you found online. You're going to have cut it out. These are my two back pieces. I always label them with 2 pins. You can see my 2 pins here, so they know these are my back pieces. You could also use a fabric pin and mark them with like a B. And these are my 2 front pieces. Now for this specific tutorial, we are actually going to keep our back and front pieces together, but we're going to switch it around. So we're going to have our right sides together. So I'm going to switch it here. Now you might notice with my material here that this is a directional material. So you can see, if you look at it, all of my trucks are facing right side up. So when I cut it out, I need to make sure that all my trucks and on my pants are going the same direction. Now if it's a tossed fabric, then the trucks might be different directions, and so it wouldn't matter so much when cutting it out. But I have, in my own experience, not looked to see if something was a directional fabric and just messed up, and have had pants that the pant legs, one side's right side up and one's upside down. So just be careful with that. Okay, so these are my backs. Again, I'm going to put 2 pins back here just for the visualization for you guys, and to make sure that I don't mess up. All right, so these are my 2 back pieces for my pants and my 2 front pieces. Now we're going to start sewing in the crotch. So that's the rounded edge here is the crotch of the pattern. So I'm gonna just pull my sewing machine up here. I'll do my front first. It's a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, so I'm gonna go over on the correct measurement on my seam guide. I'm gonna go forward and backward. And sew across the crotch. I'm gonna do the same thing on my back piece. And I'm just chain stitching, so I haven't even stopped or taken my thread off. So I'm just gonna kind of keep going. This saves a little bit on thread, and it also saves time. If you have a lot of pajamas that you're sewing for a holiday or something, a chain stitch really saves time. But make sure you label your pajamas if you do something like that, because inevitably you'll have the backs wrong, or you'll be putting, you know, size 5 with a size 8, and then you're all messed up. All right, so I've sewn my crotch seam here, and I've sewn my crotch seam here. Now, when you're sewing, it's best to do your seam allowance as you go, or excuse me, your seam finish as you go. I'm just going to do a pinked edge because it's real quick. If you have a serger, you can serge the edge. You can do a zigzag stitch. This seam finish is just to help it from fraying any further while someone's wearing it, and wearing out the seams quicker. Another tip is you can actually use your pinking shears to cut out the pattern when you cut it out on the floor, and that's totally appropriate too. It saves you a little bit of an extra step of doing your seam finishes. So now we're going to press them here, and I was always taught to press them flat and then press it open. Again, it's totally up to you how you press. That's just how I learned. You can press them to one side, whatever works for you. You can press them open like I typically do. It really, you know, it's all right. So now we're gonna I'm gonna kind of do this sideways so you can see it a little bit better. So this is my back, and I'm gonna put my front over the top so that right sides are together. Now there's two ways you can do this. You could do your side seam first, or you could do your crotch seam first. It really doesn't matter. I'm gonna go ahead and do the crotch seam first. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna match the crotch seam where the front and the back have been sewn already. So right here, and I'm gonna pin it. And then I'm going to pin down the inseam of one of the pant legs. And then I'll pin along the other inseam. Okay, so now we'll pin along this opposite leg. Do it one more time right here. Okay, so you can kind of see, I'm gonna stitch along here and then back down here. So when I open it, kind of like this, it's just one long stitch. That's basically all it is. So let's pull our machine up here. I'm just gonna start at one end of the pajama pant. So this is, I think this is the right leg. Put it in, forward and back stitch. Okay, so here I am. This is the crotch seam here. We're just going to keep going right over that crotch seam and continue down the other pant leg. So it's almost like it's just one continuous line. And we know that's not entirely true because they're two different pant legs. Now I always have people that are really worried if their hems don't match up perfect or whatever. It's fine because sometimes our cutting is off, sometimes our printing on our printer is off a little bit. Sometimes, like in this case, I actually added length to these pants for my 4-year-old who wears like a 5'6", but he needs a 4-year-old waist. So you know, it's not always going to be perfect, and that's okay because you can realign this when you go to hem it later. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. All right. So let's flip it back the right way here. So you can see here's my crotch line. Okay. I've got my crotch in. Now I'm going to pin my side seams. Now, when you pin your side seams, you want to pin from the top. Okay. You want to match the top and pin, and then go down the sides and pin. The top matching is more important than the hem matching because the hem can always be fixed later. If the top doesn't match, then your waistline will be really wonky and it will get really uncomfortable. Okay, now you don't want your hem to be off by like a million inches. If it's just off by, you know, an inch, half inch or something, you'll be fine. If it's really, really off, then there must be something wrong with your pattern, or there might be something wrong with how you cut it out, or maybe you added your inches a little bit wrong. But you're gonna notice things don't look right. It's like things are a little wonky, and that's totally normal because remember, you have a bum and your bum needs more space. And so you're forcing this front piece, which is not as wide, to fit on a back piece that is much wider, and that's totally normal. Okay, there's nothing wrong with your pattern. There's nothing wrong with your, what you're doing. Because look here, let's just show you here. If I straighten all this out, you can see this extra amount. This is the back, this is the front. You're forcing these two pieces to meet up because these two pieces are supposed to be sewn together so that you have room for your bum. It's totally normal. Okay, no freaking out. Okay, it's important to remember your body is 3D, right? You have contours and rounded edges and corners, whereas fabric is not. So we're creating that 3D effect with our fabric. All right, so I have my two sides pinned, one side seam, the other side seam. Now all we're gonna do is stitch them. So bring our machine back up here, put it in, follow our seam allowance, make sure we back stitch at the beginning and the end, and just sew. And as you go, just make sure those sides are matching up. They're nice and straight, they're not puckering. You don't want a big old pucker in your pajama pants. And again, you'll see mine are a little bit off, and that's all right. It happens. It's not the end of the world. I can fix it when I hem it, okay? Go ahead and sew the other side now. All right, so here's my pants. I've got my side seam on. I've got my inseam done. Now I'm going to take my pinking shears and I'm just going to pink along my seam allowance just to give it a seam finish so that my pants don't end up unfraying and falling apart as they get worn and washed. All right, now we're going to do the waistband. And the waistband for each pattern is going to be different depending on how wide of elastic you're using. You know, every pattern's a little bit different. For this particular pattern, we're going to turn it 1/4 of an inch, and then we're going to turn it 1 1/4 inches. And that's going to give us enough room to put our elastic. So I'm going to use, you'll want a ruler of some sort. This is a seam gauge. It just helps you kind of see what that 1 1/4 inches would look like. So when you go to press it, you're not pressing too much. You want it to be the right amount. If you have too much press, then you'll end up losing some of the length for your garment. And you don't want to lose length, especially in the crotch, because then it's going to be really uncomfortable. Length on the pants, you know, too much length isn't a bad thing because you can always take length off, but you can't really add length in the crotch. You can't give it more depth. So if you take too much away, it's not good. All right, so there's 1/4 of an inch. Now I'm going to fold it again so that that raw edge is inside. And this time, we're going to go out to 1 1/4 inches. So just about there. Okay. I'm going to pin as I go along here, just to make sure I'm getting the right amount. Now in many patterns, especially when we're talking about children's patterns, you'll find that the back is going to be much higher than the front, or at least somewhat higher. And a lot of that has to do, especially when you're talking like baby clothes, because diaper wearers need extra room on the bum for clothes to stay in place. So you'll see here, you can see here that the top, this is the back pant and this is the front, and it's a little bit higher than the front is. That is how it's supposed to be. That is normal. Okay, now when I do it, this is the back, so I've got my back pins here. We'll just move them on this side so you can see things a little better. On the back, what I do is I double pin right where I want my elastic to go, right here. So I've double pinned right there. So when I sew, I know I'm going to sew from here all the way around and stop at these double pins so that I can put my elastic inside my casing. So that's important, to leave an opening on the back side. You could leave it on the side, I guess, if you want, but the back is easiest because then you can put a tag in so that they know where the back of their pants are. And that is something that my kids are always looking for. They're always like, Mom, which one's the back? So we're gonna put it, oops, I lost my pin here. Put it in our machine here. We're gonna start at these double pins, and we're gonna stitch right along that edge that we just ironed, that folded edge. And we wanna keep it kind of tight. We don't want to, tug it, but we want to keep it tight so that the stitching and the material are nice and flat, so we don't end up with weird puckers. That's never fun. Have this odd pucker in your waistband. Okay, here's my double pin. So I'm going to sew right to those double pins and backstitch. Then I'll cut my threads here. And I've got an opening that's all ready for my elastic. So, all right, you're going to want to follow your cutting chart to know how much elastic you're going to need for the size of pants that you are sewing. It will vary from pattern to pattern, perhaps. You can also measure the hips of your child and take off about 2 inches, and then that's a good measurement for the elastic, whatever you want to do. I use a safety pin, put on one end of my elastic, and then on the opposite end, I pin it to my pants so that it doesn't get lost inside of my casing. So the biggest thing with putting elastic through your casing is trying to keep it from twisting, trying to keep it the same direction as you go. So I'm going to push my elastic through, kind of see that, and then I'm going to pull. Okay, you see that? And I'm going to push it a couple more inches through, and then I'm going to pull. Now when you get to your seams, you're going to have to make sure you can open them. That's why pressing your seams is important. It really is going to help you in this process. But you've got to thread that elastic through some of those seams. And if you have really thick material, or if your seams are really wide here, if they're real big seams, you're going to have lots more material you're fighting with to get through those seams. So just be careful and cautious of that. And as you sew more and more, you'll get the hand of it. You kind of can feel what you're looking for as you're doing this. But again, it's just one of those things you got to practice, you got to do, you got to scream at your casings and your elastic. It's just kind of the process of sewing. And someday it'll just become second nature when you're sitting there making 400 pairs of pajama pants for all those grandkids or children or nieces and nephews or whoever. Excuse me. Okay, so we've gotten to the end. So here is that was the beginning. This is the end. Now we want to make sure we can go through here. Make sure you're holding the beginning. And make sure that it's not twisted at all. Because if the elastic became twisted inside the casing, when you go to sew the end to the beginning, it's going to be twisted and it's going to be not fun to wear. Okay, so I'm going to take these off. I'm going to pull this slightly so I have a little bit more elastic on the outside. And I'm just going to overlap them about an inch, inch and a half, maybe 2 inches. Not a crazy ton, but they need to be overlapped. And then I'm going to use a zigzag stitch to stitch these layers together. So to do that, again, I'm just pulling this tight. I'm going to just put it on my machine like this. And I'm going to zigzag across. And I usually go back. And then I'm going to jump to the other side or the other edge and zigzag across and back. And that for some people might be a lot, but I feel like elastic has a tendency to unravel your stitching. At least I've had a lot of experience with that with my own kids' pajama pants. So the more I can get on there, the more the more thread that I can help keep it together. Because as it stretches, if it stretches too much, then it's going to start tearing the stitching. So, yeah, more in this case to me is a little bit better. All right, so there is my stitching. I'm just going to kind of pull so that that stitching can go inside that casing, just like that. Okay. All right. A tag can be as simple as just a contrasting piece of fabric. I mean, you could do the same fabric if you wanted, if you have extra scraps of it. I usually will pink the edges just to help it to stay from fraying and get messed up. I like using a contrasting piece because then they can find it easier. If you use the same fabric, sometimes it's hard for them to find. So I just stick it right inside my seam into that casing. You see that? So it doesn't have to be this like huge piece of material that sticks out. If you have a cutting machine, you could also do like a piece of vinyl. So I have numbers on my vinyl so that I can know what size pants these would be, but whatever you want to do. So there's my tag. I'm going to start sewing here and end over here. Put in my machine here. Oops, I'm still on a zigzag. I'm going to sew over that tag and across. And there we go. There is my elastic casing for my pajama pants. Okay, looks nice. So here I am for this particular pattern. Let me make sure that I have the right numbers here. Yeah, we're going to turn it up 1/4 inch and then 1/2 inch. So it's a fairly small hem. That's about right. And then we're going to turn it up just 1/2 inch, which like I said is pretty small, and that's normal. That might be a little big, but let's see where my 1/2 inch is here. Yeah, that looks a little better. Okay, I always like to press it. It seems a lot easier to sew to me when it's pressed. So it's kind of like this big circle. I'm just going to put the circle onto the arm of my machine so that pant leg is in there. And I'm just stitching just like I did the casing for my waistband. I'm just stitching along that folded edge. And then when I get to the end, I just overlap the stitches I just did. And that's kind of the back stitch. That overlap is kind of a natural back stitch. And you can back stitch if you want. It's not going to hurt anything. All right, so there is the hem of my pants. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other one, and then I'll show you what it looks at the end. All right. So here are my pants all sewn up. Now you're going to notice here it looks a little wonky. That's just because I need to press it and I don't have my ironing board out. So once we press all of these seams nice and flat on our iron, our pants will look really, really, really nice. Notice how nice the casing is up here. And then we got our two hems on the bottom. So that is how you sew pajama pants. Can't wait to see what you create.